As you know, the World Series is baseball's crowning event. This is the best that the sport has to offer. And some World Series moments are absolutely legendary. In fact, some of these games and moments have only become more famous as time has gone on. And you guys know what I'm talking about. In fact, there are whole World Series that have become legendary over time. Think about like the 1991 World Series, 1986, 1975, 1947, and I could go on and on. But what about the games and the whole series that people have forgotten about? Some series are famous for things other than the action on the field, like say an earthquake, but that doesn't mean that there wasn't any excitement. Some of these series are forgotten by just about everybody except for the fans of the teams involved. And sometimes even the blowouts had moments that were absolutely unforgettable. So today we're going to go back and look at the 10 best World Series games that we've all forgotten about. Now, first of all, if you're interested in watching or listening to at least some of these games, go check out my Patreon page. I've got radio broadcasts for a bunch of these games up, including some in really high quality, and I've also got video for most of the more recent games as well. And for this top 10 list, I've come up with some kind of unusual rules to keep this interesting. First of all, to make things interesting, I'm going to choose one game from each decade to put on the list. Second, to keep our focus on games you don't know about, I'm limiting the number of times the clinching games of a series can be on the list. Basically, this list of 10 games only has 1 Game 7, 1 Game 6, 1 Game 5, and 1 Game 4. The reason, obviously, is that most 7th games of the World Series are famous since it's so rare. In fact, only 2 games on this list are games that actually clinched the title. That way we can make sure that the games are actually, not that well known. And third, I have decided to stay away from using tons of video clips. So while watching is always the best option, the truth is that most of us are unfamiliar with the radio broadcasts of some of these great games. And of course, a lot of these games are forgotten precisely because they were never broadcast on television and in some cases on the radio. In other words, I'm not just staying away from video in hopes of keeping this monetized, though that reason does kind of play a factor, obviously. Now, there's one more rule here. We're only doing 20th century World Series games. The reason why is I figure most of you guys know all about the games that have been played in like the last 30 years or so. Now, we're going to go really deep into the historical archives for these ones. Anyway, before we get started with number 10, I should at least mention the few times we've had an 8th game of the World Series as kind of an honorable mention. So as you probably know, the World Series has gone to an 8th game 4 times. The first was back in 1903, the first modern World Series, though it wasn't quite as memorable since it was a best-of-9 series. Boston won that first 8th game 3-0, and the game really wasn't all that close. In fact, almost none of the games from the 1903 World Series were even remotely close. The only exception is Game 4, which was a 1-run game only because Boston came back to score 3 in the top of the 9th inning. But of course, they fell just short of tying the score. Alright, you guys already know about the 1919 World Series where the crooked Black Sox lost the 8th game at home 10-5. And then there was the famous 1912 World Series, which went to an 8th game because the second game was controversially called due to darkness with the score tied. That 8th game was the famous game where Fred Snodgrass dropped an easy pop fly in extra innings. Of course, because this is one of the most famous games in baseball history, it doesn't belong on this list. This isn't really a forgotten classic. But there is one forgotten 8th game that really is worth mentioning, and this one is a doozy. The 1921 World Series was the last best-of-9 series, and it was naturally highlighted by the amazing Babe Ruth. However, the Sultan of Swat managed to hurt his arm early in the series, forcing him to miss several games. The huge slugger surprised everybody by bunting to help the Yankees win Game 5 by a 3-1 score. So that put the Yankees up 3-2 in the best-of-9 series, but Babe Ruth then missed Games 6 and 7 due to his injury, and he wasn't able to start the pivotal Game 8. An error in the top of the first inning gave the Giants a slim 1-0 lead. That first inning also featured this pickoff throw, and if this throw had been a split second faster, the run would have never scored. The game became a low-scoring defensive affair. Desperate attempts to score through small ball proved futile. And down by a run and in their hour of need, the Yankees called upon King Ruth, even with his infected arm, to try to knock the run home. Now, we forget about how stacked the Yankees were even way back in those days. That 1921 team also featured the famous Home Run Baker in the lineup, for example. He wasn't quite the same player he was 10 years before, but it was still Home Run Baker. But not even the man with a nickname could get the job done. So Baker could do no better than a simple ground out. And when Babe Ruth came out as a pinch hitter in the 9th inning, Giants starter Al Neff decided to pitch to him and make him earn it. The mighty Ruth could only manage a weak ground ball, spoiling the Yankees' hope for a comeback. Maybe there weren't many fireworks, but the truth is that the best forgotten 8th game was clearly in 1921. Anyway, that gives you an idea of what this list is going to be like. So buckle up, Buttercup, because we've got a wild ride for you. Game number 10 on this list is a game that I know many of you guys remember. Some of you will probably wonder what it's doing on a list of forgotten games. While it's not quite as forgotten as some of the other games on this list, this is one of those 7th games that most people don't really talk much about anymore. The 1982 St. Louis Cardinals were famous for speed. This is a team that would have made John McGraw proud. The Milwaukee Brewers, meanwhile, were famous for tremendous power hitting. This was one of those classic matchups, the battle of speed versus strength. So this was the sort of World Series matchup we just don't see anymore these days. These days everybody plays in the same boring sabermetric approved style. Back then you would have teams that would bunt and run all the time, and other teams that would just stand on the bag and wait for someone to hit a 3-run homer. We're really missing out. Anyway, Milwaukee jumped out to a 3-2 lead after winning Game 5 by a 6-4 margin. The Brewers had veteran Don Sutton on tap to start Game 6. And if Sutton couldn't get it done, then they had a fully rested Pete Vukovich ready to start Game 7. So Vukovich had actually lost Game 3 of the World Series. However, he had battled against adversity all throughout the season, and he really was Milwaukee's best pitcher that year. He should not have won the Cy Young Award, which he did, but that's another story for another video. Anyway, Game 6 was supposed to be a classic, but it wound up being a wet and wild affair. Game 6 was characterized by almost 3 hours of rain delays and an offensive explosion by the Cardinals. St. Louis scored 13 runs in a blowout and probably should have had a 14th when Lonnie Smith was called out trying to steal home. I mean, you be the judge, but to me, he looks like he's safe by a mile. Safe or out, the Cardinal blowout set up a 7th game that was more exciting than people tend to remember. Vukovich faced off against Joaquin Andujar, who had beaten him back in Game 3. And it was Lonnie Smith again who helped the Cardinals come out to a lead in the bottom of the 4th of the 7th game, and here's a pretty muffled tape of Vin Scully's call.
Vukovich again ready, and the strike one pitch. The right-hander comes back, and there's a big chopper into the hole. Picked up by Yount, no play, McGee scores.
But Milwaukee came back right away doing it the way that the Brewers had done it all season long, with the long ball.
Ben Oglivie, followed by Gorman Thomas and then Roy Howell. 1-0 Cardinals in the 5th inning. And Duhar, ready and delivers. And the breaking ball is hammered to right field. And that's got a chance to go upstairs. It does. One breaking ball, and Oglivie jumps on it. Is he that good a breaking ball hitter?
No, he's that good of a power hitter, though. I was wondering...
Milwaukee was able to piece together 2 more runs in the top of the 6th to take a slim lead, but it didn't last long.
3-1 to Keith. Crowd now up on their feet as they were at County Stadium. The whole ballpark getting up. McClure out of the stretch. The 3-1 pitch with the bases loaded. Swung on. Hit into right center. It's going to fall for a base hit. In comes Ozzie Smith. Here comes Lonnie Smith. Into third goes Ramsey.
And then Bob McClure wound up giving up the lead for good.
Swinging the bat once or twice. And McClure ready. Bob's 1-2 pitch is lined into right field. Base hit. Ramsey scores, and Endes stops at second, 4-3 St. Louis.
Now, most of the highlight reels are going to show you Darrell Porter driving in another run in the bottom of the 8th inning to ice the game, but it was really that rally in the 6th inning that beat Milwaukee for good. Harvey's Wallbangers only managed one solitary single in the last 3 innings, and then the series was over. Now, the reason I included this game is because all of the really good 7th games are already really well known. This one was close enough for the list, though it is also the only game on this list that was not a late inning thriller. Anyway, on to number 9. We don't talk about it much these days, but the San Francisco Giants forced their way into a 3-game playoff series with the Los Angeles Dodgers back in 1962. The Dodgers were defending National League champions, they had also won the World Series back in '59, and they had blown the last game of the season, which led to the tie. 1962 was one of those magical seasons that ended up with 2 100-win teams tied at the top after the full schedule was complete. And the Giants somehow figured out a way to win the playoff on the road, overcoming a heartbreaking defeat in the second game to reach the World Series. One of these days, I'm going to do some sort of video about the amazing pennant races that we've forgotten about. You know, the stuff that we miss these days because we have these stupid playoffs. Anyway, 1962 was one of those seasons that just can't happen anymore since the regular season no longer matters. But boy, those pennant races were sure a lot of fun back when we had them. Anyway, the Giants and Yankees split the first 2 games, leading to Game 3 in Yankee Stadium. Billy Pierce, pitching in his 15th season, was on the mound for the Giants, facing a Yankees team that featured Mantle and Maris. Pierce managed to hold the Bombers in check until the bottom of the 7th inning when it all started to fall apart.
Here's Pierce's pitch. He swings and lines it into right field. This one's in there for a hit. 1 run in, 2 runs in. Here's Maris headed for second base. He'll go in safely.
Sure, it wasn't a home run, and of course this wasn't 1961 anymore, but that Maris hit opened up the floodgates for a 3-run Yankees 7th inning, and that lead held up until we got to the top of the 9th inning when none other than Willie Mays led off.
Here's the first pitch. A curve line to left field. This one's in there. Trash racing over, knocks it down. Here's Mays headed for second. The throw coming in. It's going to be close. He's safe at second.
The double by Mays gave the Giants some hope. However, Willie McCovey only managed to send him to third, and Orlando Cepeda popped out to short right field. And that brought up catcher Ed Bailey, who wasn't exactly known for his bat.
Stafford into the windup. Here's the pitch. Here's a long drive to right field. Maris going deep, way back. It's gone. A home run for Bailey.
That made it a 3-2 ball game, but there were 2 men out. Jim Davenport, who had his best season in 1962, came up next as the last hope for the Giants.
If Davenport gets on, here's the pitch. Here's a high fly ball to left field. This may be the ball game. Tommy Trash is waiting on it. He's waiting. He's got it. The ball game. Davenport.
And well, that's the way it goes sometimes. Now, the Giants did take the Yankees to 7 games that year. New York won the 7th game 1-0, and of course that's a really famous game where Willie McCovey just missed tying the game with a base hit in the bottom of the 9th by inches. He hit the ball just a couple inches too low. Game 3, meanwhile, is the classic game that people have forgotten all about. And the next game on this list is really bizarre when you sit down and think about it. When the Dodgers first moved to Los Angeles, they spent a few years in the Los Angeles Coliseum, which was clearly not designed for baseball. And yeah, you don't need me to tell you what the real incentive was for O'Malley to move his team into the strangest ballpark of all time. The 1959 Dodgers had their own rags to riches story, going from 7th place to best in the league, even with that bizarre ballpark. And in comparison, age-old Comiskey Park seemed really quaint and serene. Now, the left field fence in the LA Coliseum was so close you could probably have thrown the ball over it from home plate, so you would have expected there to be a lot of scoring in the games in Los Angeles. And you would kind of be correct, except for one game, and that's the game that we're talking about here. Gil Hodges had hit this 8th inning home run to give the Dodgers a 5-4 victory in Game 4 and a 3-1 lead in the series. To start Game 5 and potentially win the series, the Dodgers stuck this kid you might have heard of named Sandy Koufax out there. And that's when the hitting stopped. The two teams combined for 14 hits and only 1 run in Game 5 of the World Series. Now that's a pretty impressive feat in a ballpark that could barely even hold the sport. And the way the sole run was scored was pretty unusual. Sherm Lawler came up in the top of the 4th inning with nobody out and 2 men on.
Larry Sherry. Here's Lawler. He hits a ball down to Neal. He runs to second for 1. over to first two, but a run scores, and the White Sox take the lead.
And believe it or not, that was it. The Dodgers managed to get runners on third in the fourth, the seventh, and the eighth innings, but couldn't score. And so the White Sox won a World Series game in the LA Coliseum bandbox 1-0 on a double play. Now, number 7 on this list is really remarkable, especially if you know about the famous 1990 Oakland A's. Oakland's 1990 team was simply awesome and is still thought of as one of the best teams in the history of baseball. And all of the pundits predicted that the Athletics would sweep the Reds in the World Series that year. Now, unless you're like really, really young, you already know that the opposite happened. The Reds wound up dominating the 1990 World Series and put an end to that mini dynasty that Oakland was enjoying. But the interesting part is just how all of this happened. Cincinnati exploded for 7 runs off of famous Oakland starter Dave Stewart in the first game, which really got everyone's attention. And honestly, even the Cincinnati newspapers seemed surprised. But with the Reds up 2-1 in the top of the third inning, a certain somebody decided to take matters into his own hands, and here again is Vin Scully. I told you guys there were reasons why I wanted to use the radio broadcast. Anyway, the A's scored 2 more times in the third. Cincinnati came back with a run in the fourth, but it looked like Oakland was going to win a hard-fought 4-3 victory. And then came the bottom of the 8th inning when an obscure pinch hitter named Glenn Braggs came up with 2 men on. Braggs was credited with a ground out after this ground ball was misplayed, tying the ball game. But of course, there was still more action to come when Jose Canseco, who else, came up in the top of the 9th inning with a runner on at first. I think that it was around this time that people slowly began to realize that the Cincinnati Reds were a better team than the experts thought. And then came that big moment in the bottom of the 10th when Dennis Eckersley came out to try to extend the game. Eckersley had a 0.64 ERA in 1990, one of the greatest seasons any closer has ever had. Dennis got 1 out, but then gave up 2 straight infield singles, bringing up catcher Joe Oliver. Well, so much for the greatest closer ever. Even after 103 regular season wins and sweeping Roger Clemens and the Boston Red Sox in the ALCS, the A's simply couldn't deal with the Cincinnati Reds. And that come from behind victory in Game 2 was really the moment that changed the momentum in the series, even though most people have forgotten about it. Now, we've already had some doozies and we've still got 6 more games to go, so let's see what we've got next. Back on July 4th, 1914, the National League standings looked like this, with the Boston Braves at the bottom of the bunch. Not only did the Braves lose the 4th of July doubleheader to Brooklyn, but Boston's players got into a couple of fights in that game. These Braves were nobody's idea of a pennant-winning team, that's for sure. However, after you fast forward to October 6th, the final day of the season, it turns out that Boston won the pennant by about 10 games. So it used to be that the 1914 Miracle Braves were common knowledge among baseball fans. So if your team had like a bad April, or a bad April and a bad May, or a bad like 3 months, or a bad 4 months, like if you're a Mets fan, people would remind you about the good old Rabbit Moranville and manager George Stallings. Sure, like the rest of the National League was weakened by the Federal League in 1914, but in all honesty, coming from behind like that is still really remarkable. Now, since it's baseball, you never can tell what's about to happen. Just look at those 1990 Cincinnati Reds, after all. But most of the experts felt that the Braves were completely outclassed by Connie Mack's Athletics. This was a Philadelphia team that was so good you could really mix up the batting order however you wanted without doing much damage. And of course, this is back in the good old days when newspapers around the United States would give you extensive coverage of baseball. It's not like today where most of the articles come from like I don't know, the same company like the Atlantic or whatever that has a cushy, I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine deal with Major League Baseball, right? Anyway, the Braves surprised everybody by winning the first game 7-1, and then they had remarkable good luck in game 2. The Miracle Braves won the second game in the 9th inning 1-0, largely thanks to a great pitching outing by a guy named Bill James. I don't think this really was the greatest of all World Series games, but it does deserve a mention in this video. And it's kind of funny that the Boston Globe left the Athletics completely off the line score. So I guess they didn't want to waste a bunch of ink on all the zeros, right? Anyway, the series went back to Boston for the next 3 games, and the local fans were going absolutely crazy for this team. The hotels were packed to the max, and a line of about 400 people waited overnight to get tickets to Game 3. And of course, this is back in the days before political correctness was a thing. While knocking on wood, some people in the Boston camp wondered if a victory in Game 3 would basically clinch the entire series. And as luck would have it, Game 3 was one of those all-time classic World Series games, truly a great game that has gone forgotten, unfortunately. The teams traded runs in the early innings, and then came that famous deep dead ball era freeze. The score was 2-2 heading into the 10th, but the Athletics were threatening, and they managed to get runners on second and third with 2 men out and Eddie Collins at the plate. Collins was one of the best players of his time and wound up being named Most Valuable Player of the 1914 season. And so, in keeping with the custom of the day, Boston walked Collins, neutralizing his bat and loading the bases for a potential force out at every bag. The famous home run Baker came up next. Though he didn't go deep, Baker did the next best thing, hitting an infield single to Johnny Evers that hit the second baseman in the side and wound up scoring 2 runs. But that wasn't all, not even close. Now this was one of those games. Hank Gowdy led off the bottom of the 10th inning with a home run into the center field bleachers, yes, in the dead ball era, and that made it a 4-3 game. Then, with runners on first and third and 1 man out, Joe Connolly hit a deep fly ball to center field that scored the tying run. And it was none other than Bill James, the hero of Game 2, who came in to pitch and keep the game close. With darkness falling, the Braves managed to get runners on first and second in the bottom of the 12th inning for Herbie Moran. Moran bunted the ball back to the pitcher, who decided to try to get the lead runner at third. The throw was wild, and the crowd went wild as Gowdy scored the winning run. It's always amazing to me how little people know these days about these fascinating old games. The Braves would have likely been in a lot of trouble if they had called this game due to darkness and had to play a make-up game. Instead, they wound up with the right clutch hits at the right time, and the miracle resulted in a sweep. This really was a game of thrills, preventing the Braves from falling into the abyss. And this was back in the days when people were so desperate to watch the game that they even climbed the flagpole. And yet there are very few people these days who even think about George Stallings and his Miracle Braves. So I guess that goes to show you how human memory really is. Anyway, as you can tell, the quality of the games in this list is steadily improving. This next game, however, is one that I guarantee none of you have heard of before. The 1939 Yankees have grown into the most legendary team of all time as the years have gone on. Not only did they win 106 games and win the pennant by a mile, but they also played better than their won-loss record indicates. And of course, everybody thought the Yankees would beat the Cincinnati Reds in the World Series. But you'd be surprised at the struggle that such a dominant team had against supposedly inferior competition. The Yankees didn't rush to a victory in the first game, that's for sure. New York's problem was this man, Paul Derringer, a great control pitcher who was in the middle of his best seasons. Derringer shut down the likes of Charlie Keller and Joe DiMaggio in that first game, giving up only a single run before the 9th inning. So it was a 1-1 tie heading into the bottom of the 9th inning. Derringer managed to get one out, but up came Charlie Keller, the number 3 hitter in that famous Yankee lineup. Keller connected for a triple, just barely making it into third base ahead of the throw, as you see here. Of course, Derringer really had no choice but to walk Joe DiMaggio in that situation. Bill Dickey then hit a single which scored Keller for yet another business-like Yankee victory. Of course, if you're honest with yourself, you will realize that the Yankees actually stole this game out of the fire. Now, that's not the only game of that World Series where the famous Yankees struggled. They also struggled to win the 4th game of the 4-game sweep. That's that famous game where Cincinnati catcher Ernie Lombardi was stunned after a violent collision at the plate, which allowed 3 runs to score in the top of the 10th inning while the ball was sitting about 2 feet away from him. The Yankees won that game, sure, but there is a chance the 1939 Yankees weren't really as good as the hype. Now, for our fourth entry, we're going to go to one of those Yankees-Dodgers World Series, and this is probably one that some of you are familiar with. And though it might seem in hindsight that the Yankees and Dodgers always went to the World Series, the truth is that both teams struggled to make it in 1978. That might be why the 1978 World Series was the most watched series on television in history. It attracted an audience much larger than anything we see these days. Of course, the traditionalists were still upset that so many of these games were being played at night. And I sympathize with that point of view. I've always thought that baseball was played best in the day, especially the World Series. However, Game 2 of the 1978 World Series was clearly the best game in the series, and it provided the sort of drama that really belonged on primetime television. And man, you're in for a treat. The Dodgers demolished the Yankees in the first game. However, New York jumped out to a lead in the second game thanks to a man they call Mr. October.
Well, of his 8 World Series homers, 7 of them have come against the Dodgers, and 4 right here at this ballpark. So he likes this stage. Runners lead off first and second. Pitch to Jackson. Swung on, drilled down the right field line. Smith is after it and can't get to it. 1 run will score. The ball's lost by Smith. Now he picks it up, throws home, Munson around third, and he scores. And the Yankees now lead 2-0.
But the Dodgers came clawing back. Ron Cey singled in a run in the bottom of the 4th, and then he came up in the bottom of the 6th inning with 2 men on and 2 men out.
The 2-0 pitch. Curveball hit deep to left center. Roy White is over. That ball is gone.
This was one of those all-time classic baseball games. It's one of those games that you never forget. Reggie Jackson hit a ground out with runners on second and third in the top of the 7th to make it a 1-run game. And then things started to fall apart for the Dodgers in the top of the 9th. Bucky Dent, that's right, Bucky Dent led the inning off with a single. And after a ground out and a walk, Thurman Munson came up for the Yankees. And so Tommy Lasorda decided to bring in a kid straight up from the minors named Bob Welch to pitch to the heart of the Yankee lineup. Now, can you imagine that? Sit back and think about this for a second. Bob Welch was 21 years old. He'd pitched in maybe 24 games at the major league level all in 1978, right? I mean, he was young enough so that Reggie Jackson was probably one of his heroes when he was growing up. He hadn't come up to the Dodgers until June of that year, and he had struggled with his control from time to time, just like most young pitchers do. And here he was in the World Series, in front of the biggest television crowd in the history of baseball, and he had to pitch to 2 superstars. Now that's drama. Welch made short work of Munson.
On deck is Reggie Jackson. I don't see anybody getting loose in the Dodger bullpen, so Jackson will get a chance to bat against a right-handed pitcher. Pitch is looped to right field. Smith coming on. He's there and makes the catch.
And that set up the confrontation between the kid and the veteran. And man, oh man, this at-bat just dragged on. It lasted over 6 minutes with Jackson fouling off pitch after pitch and working it to a full count. And I'm telling you, the radio broadcast here is so much better than NBC's television broadcast.
Get out there. Okay. And Dent will be moving from second and Blair from first. The pitch swung on and missed. Jackson goes down swinging. And the ball game is over. The Dodgers charge out on the field, hugging rookie Bob Welch.
Like so many of the other games on this list, this is one of those games where people who saw it swore that they would never forget it. And then they forgot about it. Now, the nice thing is you can go watch it for yourself. Somebody decided to videotape the game. But because the Yankees then won 4 straight games, this amazing Bob Welch story in Game 2 has gone forgotten. Now, you might have heard of the next game on this list, though I would be kind of surprised. The 1927 Yankees are still considered by many to be the greatest team in baseball history. And obviously, with guys like Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, Wadey Hoyt, and so on, this was a very difficult team to beat. Naturally, everybody thought the Yankees would easily beat the Pirates in the series, including Babe Ruth, who supposedly authored this article through a ghostwriter. Thankfully, that ghostwriter trend mostly died out with the 1920s. Now, the Yankees didn't really struggle that much in this World Series. The Pirates had the lead for 2.5 innings in the 4 games that they played. But Game 4 of this series was a lot closer than you might think. A single by Glenn Wright gave the Pirates a 1-0 lead in the first inning. Ruth came back with a single of his own to tie it in the bottom of the first. And it was Ruth coming through with a big blast in the bottom of the 5th to put the Yankees on top 3-1. But the Pittsburgh Pirates actually came back, believe it or not. A single by Clyde Barnhart in the 7th made the score 3-2. And that was followed by a sacrifice fly by Paul Wainer, tying the score at 3. And this game went into the bottom of the 9th inning, which is when the Pirates finally surrendered. With 2 men on and nobody out, pitcher Johnny Milius decided to walk Babe Ruth to load the bases. Milius then reached back for a little bit extra, striking out both Lou Gehrig and Bob Musial. However, Johnny then uncorked a wild pitch, his second of the inning, which allowed Early Combs to score with the series-winning run. This was a thrilling end to a World Series that was otherwise lopsided, and this was really the first mass-market World Series of all time. This was the first series that NBC covered on the radio. After all, the station had only started up a few months before the series began. For his part, Johnny Milius has largely been forgotten, even though the newspapers sort of declared him the GOAT right away. Actually, the press was a lot more concerned with the decision to bench Hazen Collier, the Hall of Fame Pirate player who was known as Kai Kai. Collier was not injured and really was only benched because Pirate management was so upset that he had been a holdout a couple of years earlier, which doesn't make much sense. 1927 would be a great season to replay, by the way. I mean, what happens if the Pirates actually, play their star outfielder in the last month of the season? Anyway, number 2 on this list is another all-time classic game, and it's one that I'm betting most of you have never paid much attention to. The phrase Game 6 is associated with some of the most famous moments in baseball history. It's actually kind of hard to find a great Game 6 that nobody has heard of. All of the most obvious candidates are games that you and I know all about. And like I said earlier, I'm not going to get very far on YouTube if I start using video clips from things like the Denkinger call, but it's okay. There's a great World Series Game 6 out there that I'm betting most of you didn't realize was that good. The Detroit Tigers won the 1945 pennant by the slimmest of margins, helped out by a Washington outfielder named Bingo Binks, who lost a key fly ball in the sun. The Chicago Cubs, meanwhile, also went to the last week of the season before managing to outlast the St. Louis Cardinals. Though this World Series is mostly remembered for that bizarre Billy Goat curse, the truth is that it was a hard-fought series by 2 really good teams. And personally, I think that this curse thing about the Cubs was just fiction all along. There's really not good historical evidence for it, and nobody had ever heard about it until the Steve Bartman incident back in 2003. The thing is that the media always needs a really good story to sell, so it tends to latch onto the wildest rumors in hopes of finding that great story. Anyway, after the teams traded victories in the first 4 games, the Tigers won Game 5 in Chicago by an 8-4 margin. The Cubs were feeling really frustrated, and it seemed like the series was sure to go to Detroit. And things for the Cubs went from bad to worse when the Tigers scored a run in the top of the 2nd inning on a walk with the bases loaded. But you never know what might happen. This turned into one of the wildest games in World Series history. Chicago scored 4 in the bottom of the 5th and went to the top of the 8th inning with a 7-3 lead. And then it all came unraveled. After a run scored on an error, Eddie Mayo came up with nobody out and 2 men on.
The 8th inning. He delivers to the plate, and Mayo swings on it, and there's a ball laced out into center field. It drops in there for a base hit. In comes 1 run to score, and there's the try for second base, and a nice throw from Andy Pafko to second baseman Don Johnson. The slide, and it's too late. And the out is affected at second base. So it's a single all right for Mayo into center field. But he's thrown out by center fielder Andy Pafko to second baseman Don Johnson.
And then, after the Tigers added on another run, up came Hank Greenberg.
It's a 7-6 ball game in favor of the Chicago Cubs. Always ready, delivers. It's swung on. There's a long drive going deep out into left field. Lowry's back against the wall, leans up against the wall, but it's a home run for Hank Greenberg. That ties it up.
So I'm wondering if the wind wasn't blowing out at Wrigley that day. Detroit had scored 4 runs in the top of the 8th inning, and this game went into extra innings. And all of a sudden, nobody could score. Dizzy Trout came on to pitch for the Tigers, and he shut the Cubs down 1 by 1. Meanwhile, Hank Bowery pulled the same trick for the Cubs. So Trout had had 1 day's rest. Bowery, meanwhile, had pitched in Game 5 the day before, but it didn't really matter. This was one of those days where the big pitchers had that little bit extra to get everybody out, no matter how tired they were. Frank Secchi finally broke through for the Cubs in the bottom of the 12th inning, and after Bowery struck out, up came Stan Hack.
Little Jimmy Shalikas, the bat boy for the Cubs, finds one for him. Hack looks at it, says it's all right. Now he's beating the handle end of it on the ground just to make sure that it rings true. Because I doubt if Hack has ever been up to bat in a more important spot than this one right here. Billy Schuster leading down off first there. He's a Buffalo boy, born, bred, and lives there. And Hack up here with the count 1 ball and 2 strikes on him with 2 out. Now Schuster's breaking. Hack hits it. It's a clean hit out into left field. And it bounces over Greenberg's head and is rolling toward the wall. And Schuster's rounding third. And Schuster comes in to score, and the Cubs win.
Yeah, you heard right. That ball went over Greenberg's head, and Bill Schuster, who was pinch running for Seckery, came in with the winning run. This was an all-time thriller. The Tigers won that 7th game, of course, 9-3, and that's where that legend of the curse started to grow. But Game 6 was really the best of the series, and it was one of the best 6 games in World Series history. And as an interesting tidbit, the man who started the rally was a Major League umpire only a decade later. Anyway, after all of that fun, you know that I've got something special for you in the number 1 slot, right? The number 1 forgotten World Series game of all time is arguably the best World Series game ever played, and I really mean that, and most of you have never heard of it. Both Chicago and Detroit were baseball mad when the 1907 World Series came around. Now this is back in the good old days when newspapers actually had illustrations, and these illustrations are nothing short of fantastic. And I mean, even the advertisements look really, really good. So the thing I love about baseball history research is that you stumble across these fascinating relics of the past all the time. So most people these days think that the dead ball era was some sort of like silent era of baseball history with guys who were like barely semi-pro players who barely knew how the game was played. Nothing could be further from the truth. People cared deeply about the sport back then, and you can see it all through these old newspapers. You just need to actually take the time to dig in, that's all. Anyway, the Cubs came out to a 1-0 lead in the bottom of the 4th when Johnny Kling singled Frank Chance home from second. Kling was thrown out trying to advance to second base, which shows you just how aggressive the 1907 Cubs were on the base paths. And that run held up until the top of the 8th inning when the Tigers came back with a little bit of small ball of their own. Sam Crawford, the Wahoo man, singled home 1 run and another run scored on an error while Crawford made his way to third base. Then, after Ty Cobb ground out weakly, Claude Rossman hit a sacrifice fly to center field to make it 3-1 Tigers. The Tigers had Wild Bill Donovan on the mound, and it looked like the Cubs were doomed to lose. But then came the most famous 9th inning that you've never heard of. In front of a packed house, and with thousands watching around the country on scoreboards placed outside newspaper buildings, the Cubs managed to load the bases with 1 out in the bottom of the 9th. Frank Schultz hit a weak grounder to first base, and the Tigers chose to get the sure out at first instead of trying to cut off the run of the plate, which made it a 3-2 ball game. I've read as many articles as I could find about this game, and I'm still not sure if anybody second-guessed that decision at all. And yeah, it's kind of important. Del Howard then struck out, but the Tigers' catcher dropped the 3rd strike. The ball had gone back to the backstop, which was surrounded by standing room only fans. This is back in the days when they would really cram people into the park. The crowd went absolutely crazy, throwing everything they could find into the air in celebration as the Cubs had just tied the score. And honestly, this newspaper cartoon says it all. This was the dropped 3rd strike that shook the entire city. And then came the most bizarre and forgotten play in the history of the World Series. I mean, I still can't believe this. Johnny Evers then tried to steal home with 2 men out and was called out of the plate. Now, Evers was known for stealing home, and I think the Cubs would have stolen anything they could find, but stealing home in this situation was totally crazy. This game went into extra innings, and it's actually kind of hard to figure out precisely what happened next. With the crowd watching eagerly, the Cubs stole a total of 3 bases in the top of the 10th inning alone. It seems that Jimmy Slagle tried to then steal home, but he was called out, though I think it was getting a little too dark for even the newspaper writers to really see what was happening. In the end, the game wound up a 3-3 tie after 12 innings, suspended because of darkness. And that's the way one of the greatest games in World Series history ended. Anyway, it's amazing to me that people don't remember this game at all, with like the drop third strike, the 2 attempted steals of home, and all of the other nonsense. This was clearly the best first game of the World Series of all time, and I think probably was the best World Series game of all time, period. In fact, if there were video of this game out there, people would flat out call it the best World Series game of all time, and you'd see them talking about it on ESPN, even if it was in black and white. Anyway, there you go. What do you think? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let me know down in the comments.